not quite.
All right. Thank you for joining us today. And I'm going to call the July 14th, 2022 meeting of the Police Advisory and Oversight Board into order. Let's begin with board members stating their name and introducing themselves.
Sure. Tanya Graywind.
Todd Spellberg.
Conrad Thomas.
All right, and I'm Joanna Johnson. The next item is to approve the agenda. Can I get a motion to approve the agenda?
I motion to approve the agenda.
And a second?
Second.
Okay, all those in favor? Say aye.
Aye.
Okay, motion carried. The next item is to approve the minutes from the June 9th, 2022 meeting. Can I get a motion? Yep.
To approve the minutes.
A second?
I'll second.
Okay. Those in favor of the minutes?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye?
Aye.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, yeah, motion carried. All right, the next item is public comment. And those who wish to address the board, advisory board, must use the sign-in sheet, which I do have here. Speakers must state their name and will be limited to 2 minutes. Comments should not contain any profanity or personal attacks. Okay, Lillian Jones?
Is this live?
Yes.
Hello, my name is Lillian Jones. I'm a resident of South Fargo, and I'm here tonight to voice concern to this body specifically regarding the number of deceased homeless persons, specifically of color, that are pulled from our river. The reason this is coming to mind, not only have we experienced an incident involving law enforcement within the past week, but the following day, a young African-American man was pulled from the river. And it just brings to mind previous work, advocacy work, and that I had done where attention was brought to the fact that there are a lot of people of color who are deemed homeless, and those deaths are considered accidental drownings, and that's a lot of accidents that I really think deserve the attention of our local law enforcement, given the status of our community as being a leader in the state, and especially for this area where City Hall is located. I am under the impression that this is a very well surveilled area. And I just don't understand how our homeless population, though they may not have a permanent resident, they are members of our community, and their deaths deserve looking into. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Faith Dixon.
Good evening. I always get a little choked up when I have to speak, but try to do my best today. Thank you all for allowing me and the public to speak. I am hopeful that you have a listening ear. Our community is tremendously saddened and angered by the death of Shane Netterville. Let me just say, Wes and I have worked very hard to establish this board and push for police-worn body cams to allow complete transparency and police action. This police oversight board was formed to ensure checks and balances by keeping the police department accountable and by allowing this board to view video footage and to provide information to the public. Wes and I have been working with the Netterville family and were appalled and disgusted to learn and witness what this family had had to endure within the last 7 days. The lack of willingness to show compassion and complete transparency is disheartening. The family has been denied information pertaining to the well-being of Shane, which caused them to miss the opportunity to be by his side as he took his last breath. Shane Netterville died alone. And enough is enough. Shane didn't deserve this, and nobody does. I'm calling out today for the DEI, Dr. Terry Hogan, who was hired in 2021 to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I stand here today with questions unanswered and the police department holding back the truth to what really happened to Shane. I'm calling for this board to demand release of the body cam footage and to put this family's questions to rest. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Andrew Buck.
My name is Andrew Buck. I've been a resident of the city of Fargo for about 20 years now. I'd like to repeat re-echo the call that was made last month by the gentleman calling for an investigation into the events of May 30th, and specifically the police use of force on that evening. Unlike him, I was actually there on that evening. I marched all morning. I went home, I rested, and when I heard that things were beginning to get violent downtown, I returned to the downtown area in an attempt to calm protesters down and de-escalate the situation. In order to do that, I had to enter into the restricted area, and I was repeatedly tear gassed, fired at, harassed, over and over again, and including, but not limited to, an example that I'm holding here is a tear gas grenade that was fired contrary to the design of the grenade. It was fired directly at me rather than onto the street and rolling towards me. There's video of this from the traffic cameras that I was standing just a few feet away in front of the Hotel Donaldson when it occurred. I was no more than 50 feet from the officer who fired it. I saw directly down the barrel of the grenade launcher that fired it at me. He was standing on top of a police Bearcat when he did it. It was quite apparent who fired the shot, the circumstances of the shot. The video exists from multiple angles, including from a drone that was overhead operated by the police that evening. To my knowledge, there's been no investigation of this incident. I've never been contacted for a statement by the police department, although they do know that I was there. I was detained earlier in the day. I gave my name, social security number. They had a picture of me and a picture of the clothes I was wearing on the day at the time. I was personally handshaked, thanked a week later by two of the officers for my involvement in trying to de-escalate the situation, so they know I was there. However, any investigation that they have done so far has not reached out to me in any way, and I would like you, as this board, to continue to investigate that incident.
Thank you. And then we have Christopher Cohen.
So I put in writing some of the concerns that I shared at the last meeting, and which was, I'm Christopher Cohn, by the way, a Fargo resident. So my concerns were about what happened in 2020 in May and June. So I put in writing, I made 7 copies for you, some questions that I have regarding what happened on May 30th downtown. And there was somebody quoted in the forum who said when the protesters came downtown that there was already a police line across First Avenue South. And as I said last time, none of everything that happened at that time, it shook Fargo, and we're still feeling the reverberations. And as far as I know, nothing's been investigated as to what the police did right and wrong, what the city did right and wrong. And in addition, there's a video that I'm referring you to on YouTube, which shows FPD cruisers that are parked across First Avenue South. And there may have been police in riot gear shown to the crowd before anything even occurred, and that would have been a mistake. And at some point, the FPD fired tear gas. It's not clear to me if they did that before or after the main disturbance happened, when the fires were set and the dumpsters and the windows were broken. If it happened before, if they fired the tear gas before that, And essentially, they might have escalated what happened. And then also on social media, the police tried to get people to report to Child Protective Services, people who had brought their children to the protests, but they didn't put Child Protective Services phone on there. They put an internal number to the FPD on social media. Who should I turn this into?
Thank you. All right, today, in our meeting, the next part of our meeting is department updates, and Chief Zabolski is going to review police-involved critical incidents policy and protocol. And we believe this will probably take most of the entirety of the meeting.
Yes, I would assume so. And as I kind of move through here, I'm going to pause for board members to ask questions as we move through certain sections. Again, we also want to recognize the tragic events that occurred last Friday, and our thoughts and prayers out to the Netterville family as well. We met with them yesterday, along with the Attorney General, and provided them an update on the investigative process, and so that they were better informed as to what to expect in terms of what is currently happening, what will happen prior to a public decision going out from the Attorney General's office, et cetera. So they have a full understanding of that. We'll continue to, likely BCI will be the main point of contact with them as they push through with the investigation. So the idea tonight was really to go over, in general, police-involved critical incidents in those investigations and what is all involved in those investigations, some of the complexities that provide a better understanding, education for both the board and the public, in terms of why certain things are done or are not done, or why we refer things to certain agencies, and walk through that and answer your questions so that we have got a better understanding of those pieces. So to start with, we have a policy 305 that's been under review for some time. We currently have about 30 policies that I have under review for various reasons. One of them even, as mentioned by Mr. Buck there, relative to our special weapons and tactics and those types of tools and how we handle our crowd management activities. So that's also a different piece that's under review, and we are referencing a national report that came out not too long ago from the Police Executive Research Forum in terms of tactics and tools for those types of events in the future. So that's also a process that's ongoing. And we'll be happy to bring that forward to the board as we advance that policy and make those changes. So that's out there. For now, this one, the officer-involved shootings and death policy, in general, establishes procedures for the investigation of an incident in which a person is injured or dies as a result of an officer-involved shooting or as a result of other actions of an officer while acting essentially in their official capacity. Policy also is in place to ensure that these incidents are investigated in a thorough, fair, and impartial manner. There are about 4 different types of investigations that, when we get a critical incident, that evolve simultaneously and then concurrently to the initial incident itself. There is a criminal investigation of the involved officer's actions. That's currently what the Bureau of Criminal Investigation is conducting. So it's a criminal investigation in terms of whether or not that use of force was justified or not. If the use of force is justified, that is then an exception to the criminal code, and there's no criminal violations. If it is not justified, then there is criminal culpability, and the prosecuting attorney can decide on charges. So that is where BCI is working on. At the same time, there's a criminal investigation in some instances of the involved suspect or victim's actions. A lot of times, police use of deadly force results from some other crime that's in progress. For example, we respond to an armed robbery. So the man committed or gal committed an armed robbery. They leave the bank. You got crime number 1. They become involved in a shootout with the police. Crime number 2, they flee. That's crime number 3. They cross state lines into Minnesota and get into another shootout and are taken into custody, shot or killed. That's 4. So you've got multiple scenes. Those are all criminal events that also have to be investigated. And I'll walk through how that happens and who takes responsibility for those particular investigations. There's also an internal or administrative investigation, and that deals with policy compliance by the involved officers within the agency, our department. And then down the road, there can be civil investigation to determine potential liability. So those 4 things in any one of these particular instances are all in play. So as the investigations are ongoing, there's many things that the investigators and the organizations have to keep in mind as they move through each step to make sure that they don't create any problems or that all these other pieces fit together and you're not upending one of the other potential investigations. And I'll explain that in a little more detail in just a bit. So let's talk about the criminal investigation of the officer's actions. Through our policy, we send it to an outside agency, and one of the edits that we are making is really defining that the North Dakota Bureau of Criminal Investigation will be our main agency for investigating these. I've already talked to their upper echelon about this particular investigation just in terms of process, and we're going to be meeting a little bit down the road here once some of this investigation is off their plate to discuss some fine-tuning on process and protocols between both of our organizations to help that be a little bit of a smoother transition, and so that we have an understanding of each agency's policies and protocols. But they will be the agency that will investigate this. For our part, obviously these things happen in our city, and the response of North Dakota Bureau of Criminal Investigation can be an hour to an hour and a half, depending on where their agents are coming from. So we do have a responsibility to handle the active crime scene. In some instances, such as this situation, we have individuals who fled on foot. We've got just an active crime scene that we have to get control of. That's still within our responsibility, just in terms of public safety and securing any of that evidence, as well as locating any witnesses. And then from that perspective, once the scene is secured and we've identified all of those pieces, it's essentially turned over to the other investigating entity. Public safety questions are addressed, and so that's relative to the officer who actually uses force. I would refer to as the principal officer. So the principal officer at the scene will be asked public safety questions, and they have to respond to those. And that really is, did you shoot? Did you not shoot? Is anyone else hurt? Are there any other suspects or weapons outstanding? What's the direction of travel of any particular persons who are injured or who are suspects and fled? Those types of things that would affect public safety are questions that that officer would be asked and would respond to. This investigation must be separate from any administrative or internal investigation. And there's Supreme Court case law that we'll have here in a future slide that talks about that. And the reason is that in an internal investigation, we can compel statements. As the employer, as a public safety employer, we can conduct an internal investigation, and our employees have to answer those questions. It's not like a criminal investigation where they can choose not to answer questions. So the rights attributed to the general public in terms of criminal investigations also apply to law enforcement officers involved in criminal investigations. The internal investigation, because we can compel an answer from them, cannot be used in the criminal, because that would be a violation of their Fifth Amendment rights of self-incrimination. So that is kept separate, and that's a piece that comes at the end of the criminal investigation. So while you can't use the internal information in the criminal, we can use the information obtained in the criminal investigation in the subsequent internal investigation. So all of the criminal stuff will be known to our professional accountability unit before any internal investigation would be commenced. As I just mentioned, the statement of the involved officer, aside from those public safety questions, is voluntary. They have the right, like everyone else, to consult with legal counsel before they provide that statement. All of the involved officers, including principal officer and witness officers, are interviewed by the outside agency, the BCI. And that occurred in this investigation as well. The principal and involved officers are placed on paid administrative leave as circumstances dictate. And what I mean by that is, principal officer is placed on admin leave as a result of the traumatic event, but also until such time as their interview and that portion of the investigation is complete. Because, again, in order to maintain the integrity of their statement to the BCI. Involved officers who would be then witness officers may be placed on admin leave if they also feel that they need a couple extra days to decompress from the trauma of the incident. In this instance, we had both other officers back on duty after their off days. So that a couple different reasons for the paid administrative leave. And of course, the principal, even after the interview, if they're still unable to return to duty at that juncture, would stay on admin leave until such time as they were. Once ready to come back, the principal officer may be able to come back and work a transitional in-house duty. So they won't be in uniform, they would not be on the street taking calls for service or having interactions with the general public. They would perform administrative tasks within the department while the investigation is completed and the prosecutorial review is also completed. So any principal officer, and that's an individual who has actually used force in a deadly force situation, would be in that status until such time as we had the results of the prosecutor review. Obviously, not knowing what those results will be, this is done to protect really both the public and the police department from any other potential liabilities. But in the meantime, if the individual is able to come back and perform some work in-house, that also provides that opportunity for them. So that's why that is done. BCI then interviews all witnesses. They collect the evidence, monitor autopsy, file reports, etc. And all of that information then gets forwarded to the prosecutor. Now, the Bureau of Criminal Investigation, in their policy or protocols, gives themselves, or it strives rather, they say, to have their investigations done within 30 days. It sounds like by and large their investigations get done within that time frame. They have expressed again, they are working as quickly as they can on this case. They did not want to provide specific time frames, but I think that they're moving along expeditiously, and we know that this case will now be reviewed by the Attorney General's office, so that part is in place as well. Again, the prosecutor's determination is where their action is justified under North Dakota law. Either it's not criminal or there's criminal culpability, and they would potentially proceed with charges. The standard is objectively reasonable. This is a Supreme Court standard, which in a nutshell says, was the officer's use of deadly force or other force objectively reasonable? So was their decision, observations, perceptions, and reasoning objectively reasonable in the perception that their safety or someone else's safety was in jeopardy? So either to protect their lives or themselves from serious bodily injury, or someone else from death or serious bodily injury. And so all the facts of the case, including the video, which is a piece of the evidence in the case, are all provided to the prosecutor, along with the statements and all the other pieces of evidence, in determining whether or not that officer's actions were objectively reasonable. So I'm going to pause there on that portion, criminal investigation of the officer's actions, to see if there's any more questions about that piece.
I do have one. With regard to the Bureau of Criminal Investigation, can you explain they're an outside entity, correct?
Correct.
Can you explain, are they a North Dakota state entity, or who oversees the Bureau?
They are a North Dakota state entity. They work out of Bismarck. They are under the Attorney General umbrella as one of their divisions. Also under the Attorney General umbrella would be the Crime Lab, Victim Witness Services, several other state entities that are under that particular state umbrella. The prosecutors, all that stuff.
Okay.
Any other questions in this particular area?
Well, I imagine, you know, the officer that used the force, the other officers who were present, you know, I mean, they're interviewed and continue to work. Are they also provided the additional services, such as the officer who used the force, such as like mental wellness and?
Yeah, and yes, I've got that in a future slide here, but everyone involved, and this is mostly process on this particular portion, was provided peer support as well as any psychological services that they would like to take advantage of. And I'll explain that a little more in depth in just a second.
Quick question. You mentioned the BCI. So is the BCI what you consider the fair and impartial manner by which this investigation will be occurring?
Correct. Yeah, they are not attached to our department, so we don't have influence over what they do. And for the exact reasons, we don't know what the witnesses or the principal officer said, and we don't know what's on the video, as that's all part of their investigation. So until they are complete and the prosecutor is complete, that information won't be made known to us or the public.
And there is division between the BCI and the police community, because what's hard for me to understand is that there is a degree of separation between these types of communities, and how do you basically separate any type of impartiality because of the perceived brotherhood between policing communities?
Sure. Well, their agency is separate from ours. They have to actually perform their duties like everyone else. They have a lot of integrity in what they do. I don't think there's anyone in the BCI that would risk compromising their career or prison to try and do something illegal or improper in conducting one of these investigations, because the spotlight is on them as well when you look through their investigation and what they did and didn't do. And this, again, is it's not just in North Dakota, but in many, many states where they have their state entity is the go-to for these critical incident investigations. And the other part of it is you have to have not only some separation, but you have to have an agency that has the competency and the experience to investigate something of this magnitude. We couldn't just call up like a smaller police department and have them come down and investigate it. They would not have the experience to do so. They wouldn't have the staffing to do so. And there's too much at risk here, both on the community and the police department, to have an agency who is not capable of performing either from a competency perspective or a staffing perspective to do this. North Dakota, we don't have quite as many agencies to choose from. Now in Wisconsin, we had more, but even in Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Department of Criminal Investigation, DCI, was the investigating entity for probably 85% of the cases that happen in the state of Wisconsin. The city of Milwaukee and that region, southeast Wisconsin, created their own kind of individual investigative group, and they rotate doing those investigations in that part of the state because there's higher volume. And what they do for separation is they ensure that the investigators are not connected to the agency involved. We did the same thing here when BCI rolled in. I had a conversation with the supervisor to make sure that we didn't have someone as the case agent or lead investigator that was directly related to our department in terms of either relationship or had worked here, recently.
Chief, this is Scott from. I'm dialed in virtually. Quick question on the policy 305 that's currently under review. Is there anything above policy 305 that dictates the standards or the policies for processing the body cam or anything like that, or is the FPD policy the only thing that governs how that investigation is conducted.
And are you referring to how the video is kept or provided to them?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if there's is there a state code or law or anything like that that dictates that the body cam has to be handed over to BCI without any sort of, oversight board, or what's the policy
Sure.
that dictates how that process is done?
That's 424, and then we have evidence policies as well. But the body cam video is uploaded directly to evidence.com, which is a cloud storage from Axon. It is unable to be manipulated, so it's just a straight download onto a different data platform and provided to the state. So there's also a metadata trail to everything that's done with all of that video. So you can see if anyone's looked at it, watched it, etc. But there's no ability to change anything that's on the video. Does that answer your question, Scott?
It does. I'm just wondering, is there a state law or anything outside FPD that governs how the body camera footage is handled?
Mostly policy, but it's also evidence. And so there's evidentiary best practices for digital evidence and all those types of things that are inclusive in our policy. And Axon as an entity, as you know, they're international with their product. They are Criminal Justice Information Systems certified. It's really probably the best data platform, video platform in terms of not only what it captures, but also its integrity. It can't be tampered with, etc. And so it's just like any other piece of evidence at a crime scene. We pick up a weapon or a bullet or a casing, we inventory that, and that goes into our system, just like this video does. And so there's a tracking system to all of that. Does that make
I'm doing a bad job asking my question. So the policies are FPD policies that prohibit you from releasing the body camera footage.
No, that's a prosecutorial decision. So this is evidence
Okay.
that's turned over to the prosecutor. So like any other evidence, it's not just video, we couldn't release other evidence that we collected from the scene without that prosecutor's approval. Otherwise, we would run the risk of compromising their ability to prosecute or review the case. And I think that would likely subject us to some other type of adversarial action by the prosecutor. So it is our job to safeguard, collect, send for analysis, but we cannot release evidence unless the prosecutor approves it, or if there's a pending court case upon adjudication, and then we hold it until all appeals are up. So if someone gets convicted of a felony, we hold all that evidence until their appeal time limit is up, at which juncture then we can legally release that evidence, either returning it to the owner, or if it's certain things that has to be destroyed, like contraband, drugs, that type of thing, then we would destroy it. But that's more of a prosecutor judicial process.
Understood. That makes more sense. Thank you.
Okay. All right. I'm going to move to the next section here. This is a little shorter. This is the related investigation of the suspect or victim actions. Okay. This may be conducted by the outside agency, again, based on their ability to handle all of it. Sometimes it makes sense for them to handle the armed robbery, the shooting, and all these other things, especially if they're a state or even a federal entity, because otherwise we run into jurisdictional issues. We don't have that in the current case, and our agency is following up on the original auto theft complaint relative to last Friday's critical incident. So that piece, what we did do was discuss that with BCI as the outside entity, and both of us agreed that that part didn't have really an issue in terms of what had occurred, and they also didn't want to exert any staff to investigate the original auto theft. Our detectives are continuing to follow up on that initial report and potential suspect in that case. So just as an example. But again, it's based on circumstances, based on complexity, jurisdictional issues. These are also decisions that have to be made relatively quickly by those in charge of each one of the entities to try and figure out who needs to do what and who's going to be responsible for what particular pieces. The administrative and internal investigation, that's conducted by our professional accountability unit. And again, that pertains only to policy violations. Normally conducted after completion of the criminal investigation, and the Supreme Court case I talked about, Garrity versus New Jersey, if you want to reference that, is the reason that those investigations have to be separate. And it also gives us the authority to compel answers from our public safety employees, but we cannot use them in a criminal investigation, otherwise we violated the law. So best practice and our policy practice is that upon completion of the criminal, and we get all of the reports that we don't have right now, we will review all of that and then proceed with any necessary internal or administrative investigation. And that would be something upon conclusion we could also report back to this board as well. And again, their sole focus there is conformance with department policy. We do, as a matter of internal policy, collect blood from principal officers. That was done in this case. That is for internal investigation purpose only. The only way that blood could be drawn on the criminal investigation is if those investigators felt that the principal officer was in some manner under the influence of some drug or alcohol, and then they would proceed to likely do a search warrant or consent to get the blood draw from that officer. It would be part of the criminal investigation. So our blood draw is strictly internal, and we'll get the results of that, and that will be handled internally, and it'll be part of that review. Any questions on the internal process? All right. Let's talk a little bit about video recordings. All body-worn and in-car video is downloaded and provided to the investigative agency, just as I explained to Scott a short time ago. I'm imagining that we'll have quite a bit of that for them to review. Their agency protocols determine the viewing in concert with the interview process. And what I mean by that is there is a couple different ways in which, in a critical incident, body-worn video is utilized, and there's a couple fields of thought on that. In general, our officers can review their body-worn camera before they do their reports for all other general police duties. In critical incidents, we don't have them do that, of course, again, because they'll be interviewed by the outside entity, and it's that investigative agency's process which determines whether or not they're going to interview them and then look at the video with them, or they're going to let them look at the video first and then interview them. That decision lies with them, but that's also one of the things as we conduct our debrief of this that we'll be talking about, just so that we're I guess in agreement or on the same page in terms of how that should be done. So we've instructed all of our members, and it's in our 424 policy, that in critical incidents you do not review video. So that, again, keeping the integrity of that information. We do have to also download it. That's done by our professional accountability personnel, so that is kept to them and then right to BCI.
So just to verify, like, they're not to look at their video, and if they did, or if any way it was altered, it's all time stamped. And
Yes.
so when it's downloaded, if anyone looked at it, it's time stamped.
Yep, there's a metadata trail that will tell us, we pull up any video and we can see who opened it when and for how long and that kind of stuff. So it's a very good auditing trail. And then we've got the policy behind that. So if that were violated, it would be an internal policy violation.
Mm-hmm. And officers, is there ever an instance where a video is deleted for any reason? Just say the video's on and you're in the bathroom or something, like,
Yeah, it can't be deleted by the officer.
Okay.
Yeah, it can't be deleted by that. It has to be
Right.
uploaded, and then that's either a supervisor or higher. That's if there's a reason to delete it. Now, we obviously delete video based on retention, video that's not involved in a criminal investigation or an internal investigation, things of that nature. And then there's a standard, I want to say 120 days, might be wrong on that a little bit. General retention for all other video that doesn't have, it's not involved in a case, either in the city prosecutor or state prosecutor's office, or it's not part of any criminal investigation.
Okay.
And then that's basic city and state retention timeframes.
So is all shooting incidents considered critical incidents?
Yes, and actually, that's a great question, because one of the policy updates we'll be making is I want to put a little more definition to what a critical incident is. It is, a shooting is an easy one, but you also might have a pursuit or a case like that in which there's a fatality or serious injury. We would consider that going forward a critical incident. An individual that dies in our custody would be considered a critical incident. Once they've made it to the jail and are accepted at the jail, it then becomes their responsibility. But during a conveying a prisoner or during an arrest or something of that nature, we could have someone die in our custody. That will be considered a critical incident and fall under this policy. So those are some of the edits that we've already identified, just to bring a little more clarity to the existing policy. Any other questions on the video piece? Okay.
Chief?
Yes. Hi, Lucy.
Hi, Lucretia King here. I'm video dialing in. I have a question. Not with the video, but in general. If it is found that the officer has violated police policy, what would the family and the public expect the process to be done with the department itself, and how that's handled? Maybe that would be something the public would like to know.
Sure. So that would be part of, and it's a good question, Lucy. That would be part of our internal policy. I'm going to back up here a little bit. That would come under that administrative and internal investigation. So once that criminal is done and we have all that information, we'll look through and see if there's any department policy violations, and then do the investigation and take the appropriate disciplinary action, and we would report that back to the board as well. Is your question, if the prosecutor finds no criminal wrongdoing, can there still be a department policy violation? Is that kind of where you're going?
Correct. And
Yeah.
what would the family and the public expect to see as disciplinary actions in not following department policy?
Yes, so that can happen, which is why we wait for that criminal to be done. And it really just depends on, what's the policy violation. Did that person violate some policy that, the investigation of the use of force, the criminal investigation might be fine. I guess, as an example, I can think of one from my time in Milwaukee, where we had an officer involved critical incident with a homeless individual. And at the time, the department had a policy about how to deal with homeless individuals and what you should or should not do. And this officer, during the course of the contact, violated that policy, which then led to an altercation leading to that individual's death. And the criminal investigation, they're looking from justified use of force in terms of the altercation was within the law, but the policy violation led to that individual's termination. So, you can have a situation like that. And so, without knowing any of the details of this particular incident, we wouldn't be able to comment any further, but that is a possibility, because that's why we have the internal investigation. So I don't, not ascribing that to this particular case, because we don't know any details. but that is a possibility, and that's why all these different investigations are part of this kind of complex system. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense, because I think I don't remember who quoted. Forgive me if I got the wrong number for the policy. I think it was 301, where if you can, you're supposed to move out of the way. And I know we don't have all the evidence in yet, so I just was curious about that.
Great question, because I'm going to talk about that here in about one slide. So you're right on topic. So let me address that in a little more detail in a second, okay?
Okay.
All right. Debriefs, just again on the 305, just for everyone's edification, as was asked before, our peer support team was involved throughout the critical incident. They do stress debriefs individually with the involved officers, and then also as a group with all of the people that responded out to the scene, to even include if they want to attend EMS, fire, dispatch. So there's a couple of different critical incident debriefs that occur, and then those peer support folks stay involved with anyone that needs additional attention. We have a tactical kind of / operational debrief as well to address training or policy concerns that we identify. Kind of as I mentioned at the beginning, there's a few things that we identified that we would like to maybe discuss a little further in terms of some policy edits, some training within our department as well on a couple of different topics. I think that will be helpful. And so we do that kind of a debrief and kind of move forward with that in terms of making those adjustments. We also have psychological and mental health checks. And as you may be aware, as part of our new wellness program that kicked off this year, we've added a whole crew of police psychologists that are part of the International Association of Chiefs of Police Psychological Section. These folks are kind of leaders in the field, best practice in terms of dealing with not only mental health checks, but fitness for duty, PTSD, all those types of things that our law enforcement professionals have to deal with. So we've been able to involve them in this particular case as part of that process. The principal officer involved, the one using force, will be scheduled up with these individuals initially, and then as a follow-up as much as they would like, and then any other department members by request. So we've got that in place, and we've got more capacity there as well. Any questions on that piece? That's going to conclude kind of the 305 review of what's the main pieces that are in there. So I'm going to move to Lucy's question then on use of force, if you're good. All right, so 300.4.1 is moving vehicles. And you're right, there's just right out of the policy, shots fired at or from a moving vehicle involve additional considerations and risks and are rarely effective. So all of our training and everything that we tell all of our cops is that shooting at a car to stop it is not going to work, and we don't do that. The second bullet point, when feasible, okay? Officers should take reasonable steps to move out of the path of an approaching vehicle instead of discharging their firearm at the vehicle or any of its occupants. Now, there's a big difference between placing yourself in front of a vehicle and finding yourself in front of a vehicle. And a lot of these policy changes came out of many incidents that happened probably 5-8 years ago, and a lot of the best practices and policies changed as a result. If you think back a few years to some maybe old police practices, there would be instances where a cop would be like, okay, I'm going to step in front of the car and tell you to stop because I'm placing you under arrest. And now the car is going to drive right at you, and now you shoot at the car. So that was looked at nationally, and again led to a change in best practice and policy. And instead of shooting at a car, if you can get out of the way, get out of the way. But if you find yourself in a position where you can't get out of the way, then you could be in a deadly force situation, and discharging your firearm to stop that person from running you over or crushing you, or running over or crushing someone else, would be an acceptable use of force, all circumstances being appropriate, okay? So the policy does allow for that. And there's the third bullet point that really spells that out. They should only discharge a firearm at a moving vehicle or its occupants when the officer reasonably believes there are no other reasonable means available to avert the imminent threat of the vehicle, meaning you're going to get run over, someone else is going to get run over, crushed, etc., or if deadly force other than the vehicle is directed at the officer or others. So one exception is if a car is coming at you and two people are shooting at you from the car, that's a deadly force situation. So that is deadly force other than the vehicle. And so the policy explicitly details that as well. And that is how we are trained, and that is the standard by which these instances would be judged from a policy perspective. Does that answer all your questions on that, Lucy?
Yes, it does.
Okay. Any other questions from the board on the moving vehicle piece?
No.
All right. We talked about that. Okay, let's talk about public release of video a little bit. This is mostly in our 424 policy, which was updated with the push out of our body worn cameras last year, or earlier this year, I guess, right? Last fall. I'm sure it was last fall. There's a piece there, point 9, review of recorded media files. There's a couple pieces in there, and again, I mentioned this earlier. So again, explicit for our cops, except for police critical incidents. You should use it, review it, to help with your written reports and make sure everything's accurate. That part is in there. And also the part that was added as this board was being formed. This was the piece that was added at the request of everyone in the group. And so portions of the body-worn camera footage from a critical incident may be released with the approval of the responsible prosecutor and the chief to facilitate public transparency. In these instances, the department will work with the prosecutor's office to release the footage within 72 hours of the incident. Now, there are some instances in which this could be possible and some in which it could not. Regardless, we do have to have the prosecutor's approval to do any of it. So this is our commitment to, in circumstances in which the prosecutor would agree, that we would do something like that. And there are some instances, you can look nationally, where that has been done, assuming for similar reasons, to try and assuage or kind of tamp down emotional responses to these shootings by showing something that's very obvious. You know, I mean, if there's a difference between someone walking up to a cop with a gun and a cop shooting the person with the gun, that's a very different deadly force scenario than the one in which we find ourselves, where you have a vehicle and different perspectives, and you have to get all that information to determine whether or not that use of force was justified under the law. So as a more complex investigation, and again, from the prosecutor's perspective, they have determined that they aren't going to release anything until they have done their full review. They've gotten all the witness statements, they've looked at all the video and put it into full context. So this piece exists in our policy, and it could happen in certain circumstances, but it won't be able to happen in all of them, and that's exactly why it's worded the way it is. That was part of the discussion with the group as well as we put this together, and that's the very best that we can do in terms of trying to get video out as quickly as we can for public transparency, with the understanding that sometimes a video clip will not tell you the full scope, picture, perspective of everything that was going on. So that's that language. Is there any questions on that from the board?
I have a question, especially going back to the moving vehicles. I was just thinking about what you said in terms of officers being trained not to subject themselves so that they go in front of the vehicle. Hypothetically, though, once it is seen through the video that that is what happened, and because of that incident, something occurred where a person loses their life, then how is it determined whether that person had the officer had the means by which, whether he could or could not get out of the way of that moving vehicle?
Sure. I think that's really the complete analysis of the statement of the officer, the statement of the witness officers, And now, fortunately, we have all of this camera footage to show hopefully multiple views, looking at what the officer's statement reasoning was in context with that video. Does that jibe? Is there objectively reasonable that, yes, that officer could not have gotten out of the way in the split second that vehicle moved towards him? Or could that officer have moved out of the way? And that is
But
each
that's
case is-
subjected to your interpretation, though, right?
Well, it's the prosecutor's interpretation, and they're looking at it objectively with all of the evidence. And I mean, I've been involved in a lot of these different cases, and there's many examples in my mind where, especially before we actually put new policy in place in other organizations, where routinely cops would step in front of cars. I mean, when I started, that's what we did. Didn't always shoot at the car, but that was a training issue that was identified by law enforcement nationally, and that was one of the best practices that was put in place in many departments nationally. And it's here as well, and that's part of the training protocols, and they have to understand that. I think that is pretty well understood. That's been in place for, ballpark 5 to 8 years at least, I'm guessing, when those instances came down. I think it was a case out of LA again that really precipitated the national view. And, there's been some key cases across the country during my career that have led to changes in what law enforcement does. And that car thing, I'm pretty certain, came out of an LA case. But in any respect, that's part of the training, and it really has everything to do with, objectively, could that person have gotten out of the way, or were they in a position where they could not? Considering the split second that decision had to be made, speed of the vehicle, where are they, proximity, all that kind of stuff.
Chief, you mentioned multiple perspectives. So what I'm curious, do you know or can you share how many video recordings are being investigated or being looked at?
Everyone that was at that scene, they were given that. So, I know there was 3 officers there. We know that, right? We know that there had to be at least 2 squads, but I don't know where they parked. There could be in-car video. I don't know because I don't have that information. But so there's, I think, sufficient coverage there to provide them filling in any, I think, given the full context. Again, that's an assumption on my part, but we know at least we got 3 body cameras and potentially in-car video that would have captured some of this stuff.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other video questions? All right. Pretty close to on time. Any other questions? Otherwise, I'll conclude.
Board, any questions? Any more questions, Conrad, or? I'd like to apologize to my fellow board members who have joined remotely, because as the meeting started, I wasn't aware who was on the line, but so I apologize to Scott, David, and Lucy, who are all joining remotely.
It's okay.
I have one quick observation, though. I know that the Fargo Inform mentioned that that there has been court documents that have been filed indicating that the vehicle was speeding towards the officer, and I'm questioning how could they come with that decision if no one has seen the video.
I believe that was documents that were
Yes,
filed.
I can answer that. So recall that we had 2 people that fled from the vehicle, and 1 got arrested. So the arresting officer had to write down sufficient details without getting into the full details of the shooting incident, what they observed to justify that arrest, to provide probable cause for that failure to halt, and then the other subsequent charge that that individual is arrested for. So that is not that is more of a generic statement of the incident that satisfied the probable cause for that arrest of that second individual. But it's not what you're going to see from the in-depth interviews from all of the people involved. Right, so we have to justify the arrest. So we can't arrest someone without some details. So the officer had to put some information in there for that purpose. And that court document is that filing of that arrest.
But if you're trying to be transparent and have others to either agree or disagree, then obviously, to me, it seems as though this information has already been leaked, and therefore it's somewhat being compromised.
Well, I don't know that there's any other way that that could have been done because the arrest has to be documented. So, I mean, again, I think it's as generic as it could be, and it's the arresting officer's observations. And there's really nothing else that we could do in that juncture. We have to have the information for the arrest. Okay.
And I have a question. And there's no street view cameras that were in that location.
I don't know, Lucy. There may have been. If there is, BCI would have all of that information.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. We do have a discussion item on the agenda, and that is to discuss changing the August meeting to Wednesday, August 10th, as opposed to Thursday, August 11th. Does anybody have a discussion about that, or?
Motion for that.
And I don't see my fellow board members on the screen. But Lucy, Scott, and David, do you have any input on changing the August date to August 10th, Wednesday?
No, that seems fine.
No concerns here.
Yep, that seems fine to me.
All right. Can I get a motion to change?
I motion to change the date.
All right, second.
Second.
Okay, those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Okay.
Aye.
Okay, and then just one thing before we adjourn the meeting, I do want to report that last meeting, Mr. Cohen did have a concern about exactly what you presented today. We did have Dave Hoganson was able to talk with you briefly, and you were heard, Mr. Cohen. And we would like to be able to address this in a future meeting, and we would like to try to get this on the August agenda. Okay? So that's provided that everything goes to where we can, but Chief is going to put together a response to some of your questions to help for clarification and transparency, because I know, Mr. Cohen, you are not the only person with those questions. Obviously, Andrew Buck had those questions, and I know you're not the only two people in the community with those questions that you would like clarified. So I just wanted to be able to say we're hopeful to be able to put that on the August agenda. Okay? Any other business? No? Any other business? Dave, Scott, Lucy?
No.
Nope, thank you.
Okay, well, hearing none, the meeting of the Police Advisory and Oversight Board has adjourned. Our next meeting is scheduled for August 10th, Wednesday of 2022. Thank you.